Greetings and welcome to the second in our series on domestic violence, where we're going to be emphasizing, as we have done, female perpetrators and male victims. So far, we've shared a definition of domestic violence, and we talked about a couple of models that kind of dominate in the field, the Duluth model and the Boulder model. Today, I want to share about studies, research, that challenges our traditional concept of domestic violence being an issue for male perpetrators and female victims. Now, please note, I am not diminishing the reality that there are far too many cases of domestic violence, period. I just want to point out that while we often associate it with male perpetrators, there is research, there are studies that say that maybe the playing field is a little more level when you take a closer look at perhaps the types of violence and the types of acts in relation to male and female perpetrators. I want to first look at a study that was done in 1992 by researchers Stetz and Strauss, where they looked at issues of violence by identifying a national violence survey equaling more than 5,000 observations. It included 525 dating couples, and and it represented a sample of male-female relationships. So we're talking heterosexual issues right now. And we identified that relative to the results that bilateral violence accounted for approximately 49% of the responses in relation to the survey. And when I talk about bilateral violence, it's I hit you, you hit me back. You hit me, I hit you back. That means what? There's a 50% chance that the male or the female started the fight. In relation to the husband or the male alone as the violator, in the self-report. Now, understand, when Stetz and Strauss did this research, they didn't base it on police responses. They based it on surveys where people got to share relative to acts of abuse or violence. And in the previous recording, we identified the difference. Abuse is what? Something that goes on, but it's not necessarily reported by police. Where violence, if it's domestic violence, is reported by police, they've been to court, the person has been found guilty, there's a charge pending, perhaps if it's a first offense and they go through the domestic violence classes, it will be sealed. In Stetz and Strauss's work in 1992, they looked at the issue based on information that they received from a survey or a series of surveys, including over 5,000 people. Now, these people might have been involved in domestic violence, and might have been involved in domestic abuse. However, the response is not skewed relative to only including people who were found guilty of domestic violence, and that is the value that I'm finding. So in that case, in relation to the surveys that they did, they identified 49% of the responses as being what? Bilateral, which means I hit you, you hit me back. Then, in relation to the husband or the male being the dominant violator, 23% identified the male or the husband, and 28% identified the female or the wife. Now, that is in stark contrast to what we assume relative to the issue of domestic violence. Point is, when you add those up, you get almost, 100%. So we have, about 50%, bilateral, you hit me, I hit you back. About 25% male dominating the issue, and about 25% more, female dominating the issue. The playing field gets leveled in relation to those responses. Who strikes the first blow according to this research? Well, in relation to the men striking the first blow, about 44%. In relation to the female striking the first blow, about 44%. in relation to the men reporting it. When the men reported it, 44% of them struck the first blow. And in relation to the men reporting who struck the blow relative to females, 44% of the females struck the first blow. Now, in the female reports, this is the females reporting, they said that in 53% of the cases, that they struck the first blow. And in about 43% or 42% of the cases, the male struck the blow. At least, again, what? Another example of leveling this playing field. The research also pointed out that women were more likely to hit back if they had been hit. About 25% of the respondents who were involved in domestic violence stated that. In relation to the men, about 15% of them reported what? That they would tend to get hit. Now know this, they did a survey of over 5,000 people. Not all of those people were involved in domestic violence. So now I'm talking about the number of people who were actually involved with or involved themselves in domestic violence or abuse. And that would be approximately 800 to 1,000 of the ones who responded to the survey. Equal levels of violence, 40% of the couples were married. Females instigated violence against men who did not or minimally defended themselves in 16% of the married couples. So we have, you know, a situation where we're beginning to what? Maybe see that maybe when we take the issue outside of the criminal justice system, the story is somewhat different. Stetson Strauss also, you know, in their work challenged the traditional models of male as the classic perpetrator and female as the classic victim. An interesting piece they found in relation to comparing married couples, cohabitating couples, and dating couples. In the married couples, they found that in 8% of the cases, well, put it this way, 8% of the time, what, men were more severe in relation to the perpetration. In cohabitating couples, they found that in 19% of the cases, the women were more severe, and in only 8.5 cases, the men were more severe relative to what? Being seen as the primary aggressor, not by the police, but in the eyes of the respondents, male and female. For those who were dating, interesting, the females were seen as the sort of like primary aggressor in 26% of the time, and the men at 5% of the time. Now there's a pattern here, and it's a very interesting pattern. And the pattern says what? The lower the level of commitment in a relationship, the higher the probability that the female is going to be seen as the primary aggressor. We'll talk about that at some other time. If you are curious or interested in further discussion sooner, give us a call. We would love to, you know, answer your questions and involve you in a discussion. In relation to the battered male, is it a myth? Is it a reality? Well, there have been over 125 what they call scholarly investigations, 99 based on empirical studies, which means what? They actually observed, they surveyed, they talked to people. 24 of the studies dealt with reviews and or analyses associated with databases. And in relation to the number of people in what they call an aggregate sample incorporating all 123 of the investigations, they identified over 77 observations. And here's what they found. Now, in relation to the police records for domestic violence, the probability, or there was a 13.6 to a 1.3 relationship relative to male perpetrators and female perpetrators. The male perpetrators were almost 13 times more prevalent in relation to the issues when the police were involved. And it's important that we note when the police were involved. Not to diminish the effectiveness of the police. God knows we need them. But we're talking about not only domestic violence, but we're also talking about the issue of domestic abuse. When we talk about the issue of domestic abuse, we see a theme evolving where the males are also victimized. When we talk about, male victims, we're talking about men who suffer physical abuse at the hands of a partner and usually reluctant to report it. That was the number one reason why, men gave for perhaps it not being as much of an issue. They're less prone to report it. Nizanov and Bittman in 1979 did a study in relation to people self-reporting, and they found that 15.5% of the men in their study and 11.3% of the women in their study reported having hit their spouses. Well, that's a pretty even playing field. 18.6% of the men and 12.7% of the women reported having been hit by their spouses. Again, leveling the playing field. We also recognize in a national study of family violence, both genders reported equally regarding victimization and perpetrator. Strauss and Gellis in 1986 did a study comparing their data to a 1975 survey, and they realized that domestic violence against women dropped from 12.1% to 11.3%. And when that was shared in D.C., one lady said, well, yeah, the women got tired of it. Makes good sense. In relation to the domestic violence against men, it rose from 11.6% to 12.1%. A reversal relative to the trend. Severely violent incidents dropped from 3.8% to 3.0% for women, and for men from 4.6 to 4.4. Again, we see the issue of the playing field being leveled relative to male victims, female perpetrators, and male perpetrators, female victims. Males as victims. Let's look at another one. In 1986, a report appeared in the Social Work Journal of the National Association of Social Workers in December of 1986 on violence in adolescent dating relationships. And it was found that girls were more violent than the boys were. Again, a leveling of the playing field. What I'm trying to do is just build a case, just citing the fact that there are over 123 studies that point to the reality that when you look at not domestic violence, which is a court adjudicated issue, but when you look at domestic abuse and you include cases of violence that were not reported by the police, the playing field begins to get more level. Another report on premarital violence by O'Leary found that 34% of the males and 40% of the females reported engaging in some form of physical aggression against their mates in a year. 17% of women and 7% of men engaged in self-reporting severe physical aggression. That's important in relation to leveling the playing field. 35% of the men and 30% of the women reported having been abused. More men reported in private, in relation to being anonymous, in confidentiality, that they were suffering domestic violence. And that would stand to reason, and we're going to look at some of the reasons soon. In 1986, Marriage and Divorce Today, another journal, a newsletter for family and for family therapy practitioners, reported on a study by Pellimer and Fickelhor of the Family Violence Research Laboratory of the University of New Hampshire. And they included over 2,000 elderly persons in the Boston metropolitan area. And they found that 3.2% of the elderly had been abused in relation to their finding, and 52 of that 3.2% of their observations were men, another leveling of the playing field. So what I did was sort of include a variety of cohorts. We had people who were married, people who were not married, we had teenagers, we had, adults, and we had elderly people. And in all of those arenas, we're seeing when it's not an issue of domestic violence, but an issue of domestic abuse and or domestic violence, that what the field is level, the playing field is level. There is, this thing called the battered male. Is it a myth or is it a reality? Well, when you focus on the consequences of domestic violence rather than the act, police and other authorities are likely to focus more on the one who is injured the most, the one who is who has caused the most damage is seen as the primary aggressor. And there's a higher probability that the male is going to be the primary aggressor. Just the sheer size relative to the female. Even if the woman is the primary aggressor, there's a low probability that she and not her husband also or significant other will be taken. When we step away from the original purpose of addressing the issue, we should recognize that the goal is to stop all the violence, not just against women. And when we look at that, we become even more sensitized to the issue of male victims. Some people claim that men are less likely than women to report domestic violence. I've been alluding to this ever since the series began. And it's usually out of shame or out of chivalry. Shame or chivalry or fear that they won't be believed. However, the available evidence finds instead that men are more likely to call the police and they are more likely to press charges and less likely to drop them when they decide to report. A lot of times, men have been the ones to call the police, but they are also the ones who get carted off to jail. In relation to, say, gender contrasts, the Justice Department reported in 2001, that the incidence of intimate rape and assault against women dropped during that period. And they identified that it dropped by about from 1.1 million in 1993 to about 75% of that figure in 2001. Men were victims of violent crimes at the rate of 103,220. The reality is that their incidences also dropped. All I'm doing right now is making a case that men are also identified. The victims of violence are male, and in the vast majority of cases, so are the perpetrators. Boys and men, when you really look at the issue of violence in general, boys and men are most at risk of physical harm, injury, or death in relation to just staying alive and staying safe. And we are finding now that in the area of domestic situations, from a heterosexual perspective, as well as even a homosexual perspective, we recognize that men are at risk. Men are at risk. And we have to realize that. I think Philip Cook's 2009 second edition of Abused Men, The Hidden Side of Domestic Violence, is a good resource to just begin to sort of reinforce that reality. Susan Steinmetz also wrote a book in 1977. People have been looking at this for decades, entitled The Battered Husband Syndrome. It's very important that we sort of realize that there is research in the area to substantiate the claims. When we talk about, say, contrast between the genders, we realize that women are just as likely to engage in violence as men and to initiate it. Husbands were found to be more likely to push, grab, and shove in relation to the types, and their wives were more likely to use a gun or a knife, their wives or their significant others. I say that to make the point that the issue of violence is one thing. Then you have the contrast in relation to the types of violence. Yes, I think I'll say this. Technology is the great equalizer. We may not be as big as the men, as brawny as the men, as strong as the men, but we don't need to be. We have guns and knives that we can use to initiate or protect ourselves. Surprisingly, though, wives were found to be twice as likely to throw something at their husbands, and they were also more likely to kick, bite, or punch when you wanted to get downright physical about it. They were also more likely to, as I said, use a gun or knife or threaten to use a gun or knife. That was second to, that was first. Using it was second, but threatening to use a gun or knife was also cited in relation to what? How women deal with it. Strauss and Gellis, Strauss is a dominant figure in this, pointed out that what? Men were more likely to endure what they call domestic assault, but that women were more likely to be injured. So what they're saying is what? The women probably are assaulting, but maybe their punches aren't as strong. So what? A man will endure it. It doesn't mean that the punches aren't coming. It's just that they can handle them better. Why would I be so committed to this? Because I think that when we're dealing with domestic violence, we need to realize that it's an issue that is more bilateral than anything else. In 1976, Curtis reported that women were less likely to assault, but as likely to murder as men. What am I doing? Just sharing a little research to sort of introduce the reality that males as victims is not a myth. Wilt and Bannon identified non-fatal violence committed by women against men was less likely to be reported to police. Well, yeah, we kind of know that, but it's just nice to know that people are doing research to verify and substantiate it. Suzanne Steinmetz, in relation to her work, identified that the percentage of wives who have used physical violence is higher than the percentage of husbands, and that wives' average violence score tended to be higher. In other words, again, there may be more incidents of violence, but the violence on the part of the women is less effective and not reported as often. Men were somewhat more likely to cause greater injury. Women were as likely as men to initiate the physical violence with similar motives for doing it. In other words, yeah, if a man hits a woman, even if he pulls a punch, he's going to do vital harm. And that's the key to remember. So when we talk about, you know, the people who suffer attacks, yes, the men do seem to outweigh the women for various reasons. But when we start looking at the issue associated with male victims, we realize that there is strong evidence that men have good reason not to share it and to endure it, not to share it with police. You know, there's a lot of ridicule that men suffer in relation to, say, reporting it. And therefore, what? The battered male may be seen as a myth. Just like a battered wife, though, a battered husband will go to great lengths to satisfy his abusive partner. He'll do anything to keep her from physically abusing, even if it means giving up some of his rights and freedoms over a period of time. Eventually, he can find himself trapped physically, emotionally, and financially in a very dangerous situation. What am I talking about now? I'm talking about the possibility that we might have validity in talking in terms of the battered male syndrome. In 1974, a study was done which compared male and female domestic violence. And in that study, it was found that 47% of the husbands had used physical violence on their wives, 33% of the wives had used equal physical violence on their husbands. This is Gellis's work. Now, when we talk in terms of comparisons, we realize that there are, equal incidents of initiated violence or abuse, but there is contrast relative to reporting it. There is contrast relative to enduring it. We realize that in relation to homicides, 17.5% of the total homicides represented about half and half women. 17.5% of the total homicides were by men, women 16.4%. Equaling the playing field. That was back in 1974, and the numbers have not changed that much since then. When we talk in terms of the battered male, in 1958, an investigation of spousal homicide between 1948 and 1952 found that 17.8% of murder victims were husbands murdered by wives, and 8% were wives murdered by husbands. Again, just examples of leveling the playing field. In a study of spousal homicide during the period between 1976 and 1985, there was an overall ratio of 1.3 to 1.0 in relation to murdered wives to murdered husbands, equaling the playing field. Is the battered male a myth or a reality? Well, quite frankly, we're seeing more and more evidence to the support that the battered male syndrome is more than a myth. Battered husbands have historically been ignored or subjected to ridicule. Back in the 18th century, for example, in the country of France, a battered husband was made to wear an outlandish outfit and ride backwards around the village on a donkey. No wonder they might not want to report it. One reason that researchers and others have not chosen to investigate husband battering is because it was thought to be a fairly rare occurrence. And the police reports, as we pointed out, seem to bear this out. However, in some cases, you have ratios of 12 to 14.5 female-male victims. We know the officers can steer the victim through the process. However, Alana Sampson said that when the victims are men, they often want someone to, say, go with them when they go to report it because nobody's believing them. Men are much more likely to be locked into an abusive relationship out of fear of losing visitation of their children. And the list goes on and on and on. Ridicule, fear, a system that is associating them as being the perpetrator, all contribute to the disparity relative to violence and abuse. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to seeing you or talking with you later.